Good evening and welcome to Tisky Sour. I'm Michael Walker. Apologies, we had an ever so slight delay to tonight's show. We had a technical hiccup. As ever, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing very well, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm sort of starting to feel a little bit cooped up, but I cannot complain. And, one reason I cannot complain is because we have a brilliant guest this evening. Author, environmentalist, and journalist, George Monbiot. How's it going, George?
Oh, yeah, fine, thanks. I'm just carrying on doing what I'm doing. I'm in this incredibly lucky position that I work from home anyway. I'm very privileged by comparison to huge numbers of people, the nurses, the delivery drivers, all the key workers, all the people who can't get work at the moment. And so, I'm using this privilege, as I try always to do, to hold the government's feet to the fire, hold it to account for its disastrous mishandling of this crisis on top of all the other crises that we are already suffering as a result of misrule.
And so I think, throughout this show, we're going to talk about, your general take on the government's handling of coronavirus. But the main focus that we're going to start on is the government bailouts, what that tells us about climate politics. And I'm also going to see if there's any, if you're feeling hopeful about the extent to which this particular global crisis will put us in better stead to face, well, potentially an even bigger one, which is climate change. Before we go on to all of those issues, as you know, we like to have as many people watching this show live as possible. We think the ideas that are discussed on Tisky Sour and on Novara Media are important. We want to get them out there. So share the link on Twitter and Facebook. So we're going to start by talking about bailout. So as we've talked about on this show before, coronavirus has broken many business models. That's partly because of the collapse of consumer demand, partly because of huge destruction when it comes to supply chains, all basically because much of the world is in lockdown. That has meant the government has had to step up and support businesses in some senses, in perfectly justifiable ways, necessary ways in which we've celebrated furlough schemes to pay for workers who can't currently go to work. Great thing. But we do have to draw a line between what is necessary support and what is just a corporate handout. And when the government is just handing over money to profiteering businesses, which in normal times have been perfectly happy to exploit workers, destroy the environment, and evade tax. The argument or the practices of governments in handing big wads of cash to tax avoiding corporations is something that George Monbiot has covered very prominently, in fact, throughout his career. And he did so again this morning in The Guardian. So I want to go to that piece before getting his thoughts. We can riff off that. So the headline: airlines and oil giants are on the brink. No government should offer them a lifeline. And starts: do not resuscitate. The tag should be attached to the oil, airline and car industries. Government should provide financial support to company workers whilst refashioning the economy to provide new jobs in different sectors. They should prop up only those sectors that will help secure the survival of humanity and the rest of the living world. They should either buy up the dirty industries and turn them towards clean technologies, or do what they often call for but never really want: let the market decide. In other words, allow these companies to fail. Now, I want us to sort of, in a moment, get onto what might be controversial or contentious about your particular suggestions. But first of all, I thought, for some context, presumably you're writing this because you think the government are doing something else. So, I mean, could you sort of contextualize your article with how you think the government are handing money to companies when they shouldn't be?
Well, the UK government, alongside the US, a lot of other European governments, many of the rich world governments, are currently doing everything they can to bail out polluting industries, to keep the airlines in the air, to keep the oil companies solvent, and huge amounts of money. I mean, really vast amounts of money. A big chunk of the $2 trillion, which the US government is already put forward, is going into dirty industry. We see 60 billion going directly there to the airlines. In the UK, we've seen the bailout of the airlines just beginning, with a massive extension of finance, £600 million to EasyJet, just after it gave away £170 million to its shareholders, including million to one shareholder, the founder of the company. And so basically, we're just seeing the circulation of money from government into these corporations, into the pockets of the shareholders, without any proper safeguards, without any conditions attached, like you've got to change your business model, you've got to stop destroying the living world, you've got to stop trashing our life support systems. And so it seems to me that this golden opportunity to really put the economy on a new footing is being squandered, just like the golden opportunity of 2008, where the governments had banks over a barrel, and they could have told them, right, we're going to have a completely different set of banking practices worldwide now. No more exotic financial instruments, no more rat renting, no more squeezing the rest of the economy to make yourselves big. We're going to make banking really boring. We're just going to turn it into something which is there to support other aspects of the economy and not as a means of making money in its own right. It's no longer going to be predatory. They completely failed to do that. They just tried to put the existing model back on track, missed a tremendous opportunity to change the whole direction the world took, to make it a fairer, greener world. We can't afford to miss that opportunity again. There's an even bigger opportunity now, because to almost the greatest extent ever in capitalist societies, governments have private enterprise in the palm of their hand. They have them over a barrel. In the case of the oil industry, literally over hundreds of millions of barrels of unsold product. And they could, if they chose, said, okay, an end to this, an end to the destruction of our life support systems, an end to climate breakdown, ecological breakdown. We're going to do something completely different as we emerge from this pandemic. And that begins with bailing out the green companies and either buying up, government taking over, or allowing the other companies to go down.
I think we should focus probably on the allowing the companies to go down bit first, because that's the most contentious bit. And I was thinking about this, especially in the context of British Airways, who yesterday announced that they were planning to lay off 12,000 people. I sort of had a look at what Unite's statement was about that. And basically, obviously, as you'd expect, the trade union is defending those jobs. They sort of say the government should take a stake in BA, and they sort of intimate towards the idea that BA should have to demonstrate it is going to try and achieve some sort of environmental goals. But the one thing that was clear is they don't want the government to let the airline industry die. And I'm presuming that you think that there isn't really a way that BA can meaningfully green its business model. And you'd fall on the side of, we just have to let the airlines go down, actually.
Well, yeah, on the first point, there isn't a way. The airlines have produced an awful lot of greenwash about how we're going to go to net zero emissions, but all that means is basically transferring their responsibilities to other sectors of the economy through offsetting. We can't afford to do that anymore. We need, if we have any chance of avoiding 1.5 or 2 degrees of global heating or much more, to have any chance of that, every sector has to maximize its cuts. And the idea of the airlines loading their cuts onto other sectors and say, you must go way beyond net zero, you must go massively carbon negative so that we can keep flying, that is, so to speak, not going to fly. And all the technical stuff, the technical improvements they make, you're talking about shaving 2, 3, 4% off your emissions over the next 30 years. And we need to get to zero. In fact, we need to go carbon negative if we're not to get into a death spiral, basically, the collapse of what keeps us alive, which is our living planet. So yeah, you can't keep them going, and at some point or another, we're going to have to make the choice: do we support the airlines and ignore our life support systems, or do we support our life support systems and allow the airlines to go down? That decision will have to be made sooner or later, and we currently have the perfect opportunity to make that decision. So, as you say, 12,000 workers. It's the workers we should bail out. It's the people we should protect, not the corporations. And basically, their lives are hitched through no fault of their own to a totally unsustainable industry, which cannot be maintained without destroying the conditions that support life, without killing people. Every day, the airlines are killing people already by helping to exacerbate climate breakdown, wiping out people, whether it's in the Horn of Africa, whether it's in South Asia, whether it's in Central America, who are dying as a result of the climate crisis. Already that's happening. And I don't think in the long run, any worker is going to want to be hitched to that business model. So let's take this as a chance, right? We bail out the workers, we bail out the people right across the economy. These huge amounts of government money the government is talking about go to the people. And during this hiatus, during the pandemic pause, we say, right, we're going to go into a crash program of building a green economy. We're going to build completely new industries where those workers are going to have jobs when we come out of this. And the only way that's going to happen is through mass government intervention. It is not going to happen through leaving it to this mythical market.
And what do you think? Because obviously the standard demand from the trade unions, which I'm quite sympathetic towards. I think it's a really difficult quandary that sort of transition brings up, which is they say that no worker is going to give up their job for a potential job in the future. Like, do you see any way that the government could basically say we will guarantee anyone who loses a job at BA a different job on the same conditions in a different, more green industry? Or do you think that there's inevitably going to be some uncertainty and people have to suck it up?
I think it's within the power of government to guarantee that. I mean, during the Second World War, we saw what some people have described as military Keynesianism, this huge retooling in order to support a war economy in the UK and the US and many other countries, where the government basically guaranteed that manufacturing was going to happen, and as a result people were going to be employed. And it happened in a remarkably short space of time. I mean, in the US we were looking at companies completely retooling within a month, going from a civilian to a military economy. We're seeing companies right now retooling to produce ventilators. It can be done. There's nothing mysterious about it. There's nothing difficult about this. And we desperately need a whole load of new green technologies which we can start to deploy immediately. And we desperately need people to work and to run those technologies, which we can start doing immediately. But it's only going to happen with a super ambitious government program. And, I completely understand the union position. The uncertainty and security, the idea of plunging into the unknown is always scary. But actually carrying on as we are is plunging into the unknown on a far greater scale, because it's plunging into an area no human being has ever experienced before, which is basically the whole living system of the planet no longer being able to support us. And we carry on as we are with the airlines, with the oil industry, with the other planet-eating corporations. And that's the zone into which we pass, which is a far more frightening and insecure one than a change in the place of employment.
I'm going to bring in Aaron in one moment. First of all, I just want to ask, because I mean, other than the jobs bit that you say is contentious, but the idea that we need a green transition and we should take this opportunity to do that is uncontroversial. The problem is we have a conservative government. Donald Trump's in the United States. There's lots of political barriers to having a sensible, rational, and compassionate response to coronavirus. So I wanted to know if you thought that even without government intervention, to what extent do you think the decline of BA and the airline industry, for example, and potentially oil-hungry industries is going to decline anyway? BA, British Airways, their parent company, has said they're justifying these job losses by saying we're not going to return to normal even after this, even after the lockdown. That demand's not coming back. So do you think there is a kind of silver lining for someone who cares about climate change and has very little faith in the government that potentially this crisis will put us on a lower trajectory in terms of greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, of course, I don't want this left in the hands of the corporations. I mean, who are they to decide what trajectory the economy and society should take? Why have we got ourselves into this extraordinary position where we say, well, we'll just leave it to this thing called the market, which is basically the economic power of those with a lot of money, the big corporations, the millionaires, the billionaires, to decide how things shake out. That's insane. That's a crazy situation. It's a profoundly undemocratic situation as well. So, yeah, we're not where I would like us to be. That's very true. It would be completely perverse for the government to step in now and say, we're going to rescue these high carbon industries and get them back on track, get all the planes in the air once more, get all the oil pumping out of the ground once more. We're going to use taxpayers' money to do that. That would be utterly perverse and deranged in the middle of a climate emergency. So, we just have to use every political tool at our disposal to try to persuade these really unfavorable governments to do what desperately needs to be done. In the US, okay, it's a lost cause, except there's much more power in the states, in the individual states to act, and some of them are doing so to an extent. In the UK, we have this extraordinary situation where this really hard right government is having to take almost socialist positions with its bailout, because it just, it's had to abandon austerity. It's had to talk about mass borrowing, mass handouts of all kinds. So I think we are in some sort of a position to say, right, if you're giving these mass handouts, let's make sure they go to the right places. Let's put the screws on. Let's put as much pressure on as we possibly can through various media like this, through sort of mass, write-ins, all the things that we can do from home. Unfortunately, we can't do the demonstrations at the moment, but use every political tool at our disposal.
I'm going to bring Aaron in a moment. First of all, there's, I think, 1,400 of you watching at the moment. We want to get up to at least 15,000. 1,500, sorry, while we've still got George. So share the link. Aaron.
Yeah, I wanted to know George's thoughts on degrowth. So obviously there's been this debate on the left, and it's a really important debate. The conclusions aren't necessarily there for anyone. Degrowth versus green growth. The drop in CO2 emissions hasn't been that big, given the fact that economic activity has gone on ice. I think globally we're going to see a CO2 drop this year of about 5%. And okay, that's in line with sort of global output, which will probably also fall by about 5%. But if you look at wealthier countries like Britain and the US, actually the falls in CO2 emissions aren't really mapping onto falls in economic activity. So do you think that this, while it's an opportunity to make arguments around climate change, do you think that the coronavirus crisis also offers something of a rebuttal to the kind of degrowth arguments? We could basically get rid of 50% of the economy. We'd still be probably in big trouble in terms of climate change. Where do you stand on that debate, and how has this crisis reoriented the debate between green growth, degrowth?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So it is interesting, isn't it, that this massive change in our lives has resulted in just a 5% cut in greenhouse gas emissions. We're still at 95% of the previous emissions, despite all staying at home. And what it does show is that individual action doesn't cut it. That, just changing our transport habits, or not even traveling at all, isn't by any means enough. I mean, we still have manufacturing industry, we still have cement production, aluminium production going on as before, more or less. We still have consumption manufacturing taking place more or less as before, shutdowns in some places, but by no means comprehensive. We're still using electricity right now, and a lot of that is coming from dirty sources. We're still using heating and the rest of it. So basically we need structural change if we're going to address that. That's lesson number one. But I don't think what our experience at the moment really bears very heavily either way on the green growth, degrowth debate, simply because this is a really peculiar and weird situation we're in. The measures we're taking for the pandemic are not in any way similar to the measures that we need to take for climate, except traveling less. That's the only thing, the only intersection really. To address the climate crisis, we actually need to take far less severe measures than we're taking for the pandemic, because a lot of them are technical measures. It's technological change. It's shifting from one means of production to a different means of production. It's shifting from one kind of electricity production to a different kind. It's not nearly as difficult as responding to the pandemic. So why the hell aren't we doing it? It's one thing the pandemic does show us is that when governments want to take action, they can take action. It's just a question of political will. So, but on the wider question, I mean, I very much favour the degrowth approach, because what I see is that even if you green the economy and you have loads of people making money in much greener sectors than before, they might earn green, but they're still likely to spend brown. I mean, the number of people I know who've got executive positions in in a green energy company, for instance, and then fly to Thailand for their holidays, or buy themselves a very nice, maybe electric car, but it's got vast environmental manufacturing costs. It's basically, I think what we need is a far better distributed economy, with a much stronger distribution of wealth, where we make sure that absolutely no one falls below a certain line, but much stronger caps on wealth as well, that no one rises above a certain line either in terms of their consumptive power, because it's that which is trashing the planet. It's a tiny number of people are doing the great majority of the damage, and it's because those are the richest people, and wealth almost inexorably translates into higher consumption, and higher consumption translates into environmental disaster.
We're obviously going to see this monumental economic crash over the next quarter, probably the rest of this year. And then in the years that come after that, we're going to see very low rates of economic growth. And if there is an opportunity for people like George, who've been making the case for a different kind of economy for 20 years, if there's going to be an opportunity, I presume it might be then. If aviation doesn't go back to normal, even by people, for people that want it to happen, for instance, Norwegian Airlines, their baseline scenario is that they're not going to get their entire fleet operating until January 2022. I mean, there does seem to me like there will be a window probably next year where the social distancing measures aren't quite as aggressive as they're going to be for the rest of this year, but people are looking for rates of return, new industrial models. Governments might be quite open to the idea of, oh yeah, we want to create lots of jobs and just have a big stimulus because we're really worried about a kind of political overhead to this, and being really unpopular, because governments don't like being unpopular. And so it does seem to me there's like an opening there for the green growth argument. At the same time, I think all of us have, I live by the sea. I've been walking along the beach, and the water in my life on the south coast has never looked clearer. And so there's an element, obviously, of the degrowth stuff, a different kind of society, but it's also about linking that to a different kind of industrial modernity, which is beyond fossil fuels. And it's a bit of a tightrope, but I'm just fascinated as to how that's going to play out, because so far on the sort of green side of the left, there's been this tension of green growth versus degrowth, and I wonder what kind of narrative can bring them together.
First thing to say is it's a constructive tension. It's no bad thing to be having this debate, and we don't necessarily want to resolve it in a pressing hurry. We've got to keep talking about this stuff. We've got to keep negotiating over it. We've got to keep assessing the evidence, and evidence may well change from year to year on this. So, let's not see the fact that there is that creative tension as being a bad thing. I don't think it is at all. The second thing to say is, the pandemic is an emergency, and it's rightly being treated as an emergency. In fact, it's not being sufficiently treated as an emergency by some governments, such as our own, which were far too slow to act, which is why we're in the mess we're in at the moment. But underlying this is a far, far greater emergency, the biggest predicament that humankind has ever faced, which is the gathering collapse of our life support systems. And so always, I think, in tackling that, we need to do what the government should have done with the pandemic, which is to err on the side of caution, take the careful route until we know it's safe to go further. And I would say that where the crisis, the environmental crisis is concerned, the side of caution is degrowth. Is like, maybe possibly there are certain forms of growth which can be reconciled with the protection of the living planet. It seems less likely to me at present than the idea of less growth means less damage. And so if we do have the option, if we can take the path of degrowth, and I think there is an opportunity for that, that is the first one that I would take. I would say in the hierarchy of approaches, try that first.
I think that makes a lot of sense, looking at it as a precautionary principle. I want to sort of, with my final question to you, and we'll get one from the audience, is sorry, I just noticed I touched my face. I spoke to an epidemiologist who was scratching his face with his pen, and I should start doing that, really. Is not about what you think should happen, but what you think will happen. And I want to know if you're an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to climate change and coronavirus. So I think the optimistic take is that coronavirus, one, has shown the limits of neoliberalism. We've really seen the damage that it does to have a state with no capacity to respond to crises. It also has, brought about, I would hope, an awareness that we as a society need to look at future risks and deal with them in the present instead of putting them off, because I think many people will come to recognize that we could have foreseen a pandemic and the government didn't prepare because our politics is structured to only really consider short-term problems. The pessimist, though, says that we're going to have a massive recession. What often happens in times of economic crises is that governments say, we can't afford the luxury of discussing green economies and climate change. What we need to do is get the economy moving as quickly as possible, jobs, jobs, jobs. And that means that we can't afford to, tax heavily emissions. We can't afford to have a green transition at this point in time, because the short-term requirements, which are more urgent, more electorally urgent, again, is growth. So, I mean, where do you sit on those two, on the end of that spectrum?
Well, I think both of those are plausible positions. I don't think they need necessarily evolve passively. We have a role in this, in determining what happens politically. That is what we're supposed to do. That is in a way what democracies live off, is people's willingness to step up and say, this is what we want and we don't want that. So, let's not just sit back and see what happens. Let's mobilize for the change we want. But of course, there's a real danger. There's a real danger that, they'll just try to reinvent the bad old dirty economy as quickly as they possibly can. But, I think this could be a real moment of change where that whole story, we can't act, governments are really weak and powerless, there's very little we can do, people would never take it. That story is just completely fallen apart. Just to take one example, for years now, we've been told, oh, what a pity about homelessness. We would love everyone to have a home, but it just can't be done. It's a real shame. And, we, the government, are trying really hard, but, the homeless will always be with us. Suddenly, pandemic hits, bang, everyone should be housed instantly. We need to find homes for everybody because otherwise they'll spread disease. I said, oh, so it can be done. Well, so all those years when you were telling us it couldn't be done, you were lying to us. It was complete bollocks. And we see that with issue after issue, a whole series of issues where they say it couldn't be done. We can't break austerity. There's no alternative. This is the only way to do. Governments can't borrow beyond a certain point. We just can't do it. It's impossible. Suddenly it's possible. They think, okay, if it's possible for the pandemic, it is possible for all the other issues that we face. And we must use that knowledge again and again and again. And we must constantly confront governments with it, saying, you said it couldn't be done, but when you needed to, you did it. It's not a question of economics. It's not a question of physics. It's a question of political will. And it's us, through mobilizing, who must put the government in a position where it has no choice but to exercise that political will to change society for the better.
I'm going to bring in JSol now, who has tweeted on the hashtag Tysky Sour. George speaks so much sense and is incredibly eloquent. Thank you very much for getting him on. What books would he recommend to read during lockdown?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, I've been reading. I've actually been reading about soil ecology. My lockdown project is to learn as much as I possibly can. So I've been reading some very boring textbooks on soil ecology, but relevant to this debate. Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics, is a really key text. I'm sure many of your viewers have already read it. I think there's a huge, very interesting online literature developing very rapidly in response to the pandemic. And every day now I'm coming across really fascinating stuff, on various websites, whether it's The Conversation or whether it's Novara Media, or, there's a huge amount of stuff which is tracking our evolving conversation. And in a way, it makes a lot of what we were discussing before almost irrelevant. I mean, obviously it's an underpinning, but it gives us the sort of chance to really rethink things in an even more radical way than we were doing before. I mean, I'm looking at what I was writing before this, and it was all sort of hopeful. Well, I don't think we need to be hopeful anymore. We can see that actually massive change can just happen just like that. We can turn economies around in a sixpence if we need to. So it's almost as if we now need a completely new literature to say, we're past the age of hope. We're now in the era of just doing it. And here's what we can just do. Let's just do it, because governments have proven that it can be done when it needs to be.
It's a great call to action to finish off our conversation. I totally agree with you in terms of this new literature where, the realms of what can be done has just been so dramatically expanded over the past 3 months that I think all of us need to reconsider. Should we be a bit more ambitious in terms of what we're demanding?
Yeah.
Aaron, any final thoughts before we let George go?
No, I think that's a really important observation, is that sort of the leftist contribution is no longer speculative. And that's something which I think we all have to think about. And it's not just the theoretical interventions, it's also the practical ones. These will be conversations that are happening left, right, and centre. I mean, going back to the idea of growth, where I think that would be very germane would be in a local sort of area. If you're high street and half of the shops have already gone, the other half go as a result of the coronavirus, people will say, well, what kind of jobs do we want? Or what kind of work do we think is fitting for the 21st century? And so I couldn't agree more with what George said. That's not a speculative conversation anymore. Those businesses are going, and the left's going to have to generate new literature, new sets of ideas, new practices. I'm confident about that, for sure. I'm a lot more confident than I would have been a couple of years ago. That's for sure.
And we've also seen this tremendous social insurgency, this resurgence of social power of the commons, mutual aid groups setting up, people helping each other, people filling the gaps that governments for many years have left. We can build on that too. A couple of books I'd recommend would be The Plunder of the Commons by Guy Standing and Free, Fair and Alive by David Bollier and Silke Helfrich, which both show how the commons work in practice. And I believe, on the left, we've been far too obsessed by market versus state. And, market versus state is very important, but there's the household and the commons as well, which are two other crucial aspects of the economy, pillars of the economy. And we should be putting far more emphasis on them as well. And we've seen so much of that emphasis, often in a very positive way, during this pandemic. So, yeah, we're in the age of action now, and it's beholden on us to take it.
We should have a longer conversation about the commons specifically, actually, at a future date. And I think our audience will appreciate some book recommendations, not about soil, because it is quite niche. Although my partner's actually constantly reading about soil at the moment because he's trying to bring our plants back to life. All right, George, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Aaron. Great to talk to you.
George. Yeah, pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.
Great thinker.
Oh, I love George. You meet somebody, and when you meet them, obviously it comes across through the screen as well, but he's just a very generous soul, very lovely person.
I went actually a bit George Monbiot, someone I went a bit full circle with in terms of my politics, because one of the first sort of political movements I was involved in was Climate Camp when it was outside Heathrow. And I was a bit of a liberal at that point in time. And I remember listening to George and thinking like, yes, this man speaks so much sense. And he was in an argument with an anarchist guy who'd been organizing it, who was sort of saying, you know, we have to do grassroots, and George was like, no, actually, we need the state to intervene and do some big things. And I was like, yes. And then I became a bit of an anarchist, and I was like, oh, actually, no, what's George doing, this liberal statist guy? Then sort of full circle, I'm like, yeah, let's have the state do the big interventions. I'm probably more statist than George now, in fact.
Well, I don't know. I think I don't want to sound like a technocrat, heaven forbid, but you do need to be led by the evidence. It's clear that certain things can be done through mutual aid, mutual activity, self-organizing. But if you want to decarbonize the global economy in 15, 20 years, there's clearly going to be a major role for the state. There's just absolutely no other way of doing it.
Yeah, we're both on the same page there. Fox has just reminded me, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel. We want to get our numbers up. I want to get to 100K by the end of the summer, because it keeps me awake at night. Okay, we're going to go to our next story. We've got 3 stories from today coming up. The first one was written up in The Guardian. It's about inquest into NHS staff coronavirus. Inquest into NHS staff coronavirus deaths, told not to look at PPE shortages. So the story here, we talked yesterday about how PPE has been very lacking in terms of the government providing it to people on the front line. Almost 100 people we know have died working for the NHS, potentially more, because it takes a while for that information to come through. Obviously, when you have deaths which are from unnatural causes, you can have inquests into them. So that's a coroner-led investigation to find out what the cause of death was. Now, this is potentially one important means by which people can, one, get justice, but also that we can hold the government to account for the failures that have led to, tragically, people losing their lives when they have been working on the front line in this time of great need. So I'm going to now go to a quote from The Guardian to talk about this particular story. So can we get this up, graphic 5? So the Chief Coroner for England and Wales, Mark Lucroft QC, has issued guidance that an inquest would not be a satisfactory means of deciding whether adequate general policies and arrangements were in place for provision of PPE to healthcare workers. Lucroft said that if there were reason to suspect that some human failure contributed to the person being infected with the virus, an inquest may be required. The coroner may need to consider whether any failures of precautions in a particular workplace caused the deceased to contract the virus and so contributed to death. But he added, an inquest is not the right forum for addressing concerns about high-level government or public policy. Now, that's the issue at the end that has really concerned people, including the head of the Doctors Association, and the Labour Party are also raised concerns about this. The fact that coroners are being told it's not within their remit to question whether or not government advice in terms of PPE was adequate. They're saying the coroner will be able to look into whether in the workplace, in that particular hospital, a decision was made which led to someone's death. But if in that hospital they were just correctly applying the government regulations, then that's all the inquest needs to find out. And what's incredibly important, especially given what was revealed in that Panorama documentary, the fact that government advice when it comes to what PPE is necessary has been determined by supply. The fact that that government advice is not going to be addressed by coroners is quite worrying. The argument that the government would make here is, they say, those broader issues which are concerned with government policy and public policy, they should be dealt with in a broader public inquiry. The public inquiry will be judge-led. It will take into account all the information available. The problem there, though, and the worry, is that public inquiries take years because they only report so far after the particular event. Normally, the politician in charge is out of power. So the Iraq War inquiry, that wasn't published until after 2015. So until at least a decade after Tony Blair had taken Britain into the Iraq War. So there's a big fear that if inquests aren't able to deal with these incredibly important questions, then they won't be dealt with for years to come. Aaron, what do you make of this?
Yeah, it seems very weird. I think the better analogy for us really is the Hutton inquiry. And you have to remember the Hutton inquiry, which was in response to the death of Dr. David Kelly, weapons inspector, who was believed to be the primary source for Andrew Gilligan, who leaked to Mr. Gilligan, apparently, the idea of the 45-minute claim, the sexed up dossier. David Kelly, like I say, died. Claims were it was under suspicious circumstances. Now, the reason there's a school of thought which says the reason why there was an inquiry rather than a coroner's report, and there wasn't a coroner's report, a proper one, is because a coroner can record an open cause of death. And actually, with suicides, often there's a very high threshold to say this was a suicide, some assert that the reason why it was not a coroner that did Dr. David Kelly's death was because actually, you could probably leave an open cause of death. It wasn't necessarily like beyond all reasonable doubt that it was suicide. So there was a political intervention there to make it an inquiry. And actually, there's really strong evidence to suggest that even an inquiry isn't really, certain kinds of inquiry aren't sufficiently strong. So, for instance, the Hutton inquiry, it didn't make people swear under oath, for instance. You can have inquiries where it's basically a cross-examination, like a Q&A. You can have a stronger judge-led inquiry where people are cross-examined under oath. You had, for instance, in the Hutton inquiry, Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, but they weren't under oath. So even an inquiry, there's sort of grades of detail there which really, really matter. But I would say any sort of public intervention where we're not having coroners establish how people are dying, I think that could be used for very underhanded political objectives, and so we need to be very concerned about that. And I don't see why why can't you do both? You can have a coroner's report and then have an inquiry into I don't know, individual deaths or X number of deaths. It depends, obviously, how many we see going forward. I think we have to have multiple inquiries, actually, but I don't see why that would have to come at the cost of coroner's reports. It's unclear to me.
Well, there's still going to be a coroner report. The issue is that the coroner report is not going to. The coroners are being told they should not consider whether or not government policy was appropriate, whether or not, for example, the government downgrading coronavirus from a highly dangerous infectious disease to not a highly infectious dangerous disease led to someone's death.
Let me clarify my intervention then by saying there's a concern that you don't have coroners actually recording causes of death. Coroners generally called in if the cause of death is suspect or there are strange circumstances under which somebody has died: suicide, murder, negligence, workplace accident, etc. There could be a political intervention here, like we see with Hutton, where you don't have coroners actually dealing with lots of people. You say, oh, well, we're just going to have an inquiry. And like you say, Michael, that inquiry could be toothless. It could be done in 10 years' time. Who chose, who was a law lord, Lord Hutton? Who chose him? Charlie Falconer. Who was Charlie Falconer? The former housemate of Tony Blair. So the idea of an independent inquiry, it can be stretching it sometimes. We absolutely need a series of inquiries. But we should probably keep an eye on the politics of this, and the government potentially, like New Labour tried to do, or did successfully rather, actually try and subvert the professional kind of role of coroners.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing to look out for here in terms of the government response to coronavirus is something they've been very good at doing, is giving the impression of maximum transparency, whilst when it comes to substance, doing the opposite. So, keeping, for example, the minutes of SAGE meetings private, whilst constantly putting out the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer. So the impression given to the government is we are here and we are willing to be scrutinized. But when it comes to how someone could actually, really challenge what's going on, they make that much more difficult. I want to just touch on
Can I say one thing quickly?
Yep, go on.
I saw somebody in the comments say that, oh, David Kelly definitely killed himself. I think it's 50-50. I think the circumstances are very suspicious. What I would say is the Hutton inquiry was an absolute disgrace and a travesty of justice. And if you ever want to rebut the idea that, oh, inquiries are always the answer, look at the Hutton inquiry. It was a shambles. And I don't think any objective person could say otherwise.
Another PPE story. This is an update from last night. So we talked yesterday about, how pathetic the government's attempt or failure to even bother to try and get adequate PPE to the front line has put lives at risk. This morning, the Daily Mail launched or splashed with their new campaign to fly PPE from China to Britain. I want to take a look at that front page, first of all. So they've bought 150,000 coveralls and masks for £1 million, had them flown over. Clearly whoever gets to use those masks will probably be appreciative of them. It's better than nothing. But also, this is a massive PR stunt from a paper that backed austerity to the hilt, and also 150,000 coveralls and masks is absolutely nothing. It's just a drop in the ocean. But fine, you'd expect a right-wing tabloid to go for these kind of duplicitous PR stunts. But guess who retweeted it with their comment? Yes, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. He retweeted this last night saying, "A brilliant initiative from Daily Mail UK in our national effort to tackle #coronavirus." And I mean, fine, it doesn't do much harm him retweeting this. But the thing that irked me looking at this, right, is he's the health secretary. So there's a couple of issues. One, he's been standing up at those press conferences every day and saying the reason we haven't got enough PPE is because there's a global shortage, right? Now, if there was and that suggests that you can't just solve the problem by flying over some more stuff from China because there's a global shortage. If the reason frontline staff aren't having enough PPE is because enough newspapers haven't put forward £1 million to fly it over, then that really is, government failure. And it all just fits into that same pattern of the government really failing to fulfill their own responsibilities and resorting to Twitter to make stupid, ridiculous statements, which generally imply, we're all in this together. And, I just think it's an abdication of responsibility and looks pretty ridiculous. What do you think, Aaron?
Well, bear in mind that the media organization, the media group, which owns the Daily Mail and the Mail Online, the chief there is a gentleman called Lord Rothermere. I think the third Viscount Rothermere, whatever his name is. The guy doesn't pay a single penny in tax. He lives as a tax exile. It's a status he inherited from his father. So why doesn't Rothermere pay his taxes to properly fund the NHS rather than have his toilet roll of a newspaper take the mickey out of the rest of us, quite frankly, by saying that it's bought £1 million worth of PPE? Because that really doesn't scratch the surface. And the reality is, tax-dodging billionaires were precisely the people who own and control Britain's print media in particular, people like Rothermere, actually, if they just paid their fair share, would contribute a lot more. And so I wouldn't even call this a sticking plaster. I would call it an alibi. Now, the most egregious thing of all is that this was an alibi shared by the Secretary of State for Health. Why is that? Because they're complicit. Why is that? Because people like Rothermere are precisely the people that give money and support the Tory party politically. And I mean that quite literally. Lord Rothermere was close friends to David Cameron. The Barclay brothers, who live on an island in the Jersey Islands, they're tax exiles. They own the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator. They're Tory party donors. So if these people just wanted to pay their tax, rather than give their friends on the Tory benches a free pass, we might not have 45,000 people dead.
We're going to go to our next story. And this story is, shocking, but also kind of, entertaining is the wrong word. It's a striking story. So we've talked a lot on this show about how neoliberalism and austerity has gutted the state and its capacity to deal properly with crises. And one outcome of that is that when the state has to solve a problem, instead of going to bureaucrats and the civil service and the Department of Health, for example, they ask for help from completely unrelated businesses. So we've already seen Deloitte be put in charge of testing in Chessington World of Adventures, and many people got sent the results for different people. It was a shit show, unsurprisingly, because they're a consultancy. They're not a company that normally does testing. In a sort of macabre turn of events, this was also the case when it came to mortuaries. So one bit of preparation the government had to do when preparing for the peak of coronavirus was expanding the country's capacity in morgues. As we've talked about in previous shows, the number of deaths in this period is the highest it has been on record in terms of the number of people dying every week. And to expand capacity, they asked festival firms. Sounds odd. And in fact, it does seem like it was as disastrous as it would sound, that festival companies aren't actually particularly good at running morgues. We're going to go to another story in The Guardian now. I want to get to a couple of quotes from that. So graphic 10. The Strategic Coordination Group, part of the London Resilience Forum, an umbrella group of emergency and public services coordinating the response to COVID-19, contracted Loud Sound, an events management firm that specializes in music festivals, to run the mortuaries and transport deceased people. So the next one. So 2 people told The Guardian they were recruited to work as body handlers. Recruits were sent for a day's training at Breakspear Crematorium in Ruislip, Middlesex, which lasted only 2 hours, they said. No medical professionals or morticians were present, they claimed, and the training consisted of an operations manager reading aloud from sheets of paper. So these are people with no background or history as undertakers. They're now just being given an hour and a half training where someone reads from a sheet of paper. But they were actually told to attend a second meeting, you might think. So maybe they got some proper training there. Let's go to the next graphic. The recruits were told to attend a second training day at a temporary mortuary at Wanstead Flats, North East London, the day before starting work. The training allegedly lasted 90 minutes, and recruits were given no guidance on protecting themselves from bodily fluids or other potential health and safety hazards from corpses, they claimed. Now, you'd have thought that in the middle of a pandemic, when people are dying from a highly infectious disease that we're all staying in our houses to try and stop the transmission of, the people who are moving those bodies might get some basic training in how not to catch the disease from the dead bodies. It's all really horrible topic, really, isn't it? It's important to cover nonetheless. And before I go to you, Aaron, I just want to point out that you might think, at least if you're going to put people in harm's way, give them poor training, sort of, you say, look, of course, some people have to do difficult jobs in the middle of a pandemic. Maybe the least you could do is give them decent terms and conditions when it comes to their employment contract. No, that definitely didn't happen. So let's go to this final graphic. The recruits were told they would be paid £12.50 an hour, working 60 hours a week from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. or 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. No contracts of employment were produced. Workers would be told by text message when to report for work and would be required to submit invoices to get paid. NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements, were emailed to recruits to sign before starting work. Staff were given wristbands bearing the name Hub Logistics, which is part of Loud Sound. Now, I mean, this is all just thoroughly dystopian. So you've got people who are working 60-hour weeks, completely untrained. They're being told, they're moving dead bodies from van to van of people who've died of a pandemic. They've been given absolutely no training as to how to keep themselves safe doing this. They're getting paid pretty shit money for the jobs they're doing. I mean, this is just, you couldn't have a better symbol of what neoliberal crisis management looks like.
Crazy. A few things initially, I guess. How did Loud Sound get the contract? That's the first big question for me. How are they viewed as offering good value, being able to keep people safe, etc.? What were the criteria by which these contracts are being dished out? That'd be my first question, I suppose. Secondly, how is this legal? I would have thought there's a pretty decent safeguarding threshold around the transportation of dead bodies. I would have thought, but then it's never been a huge market before, I guess, right? But then in the week to April 17th, we saw a doubling of deaths in England. So I suppose there isn't the capacity. So you obviously have to bring new people into it. So I understand that people who weren't previously doing it are probably going to have to do it. I understand that. But I mean, if there is no legal guidelines around the transportation of a corpse, I find that very hard to believe. I find that incredibly hard to believe. I mean, it's the easiest way to spread disease of any kind.
And I mean, I think the bigger issue, because obviously you are going to, we're in a disaster, which, I mean, they always say we couldn't have predicted it's a global crisis. We think that they should have had planning in place a long time ago. But obviously you're going to have to get some people to do jobs that they wouldn't normally be doing. And I think there are many people who are willing to do jobs that they wouldn't normally be doing. People who can't go into their office job or who can't go into their gardening job and are happy to put themselves forward to do the kind of essential but kind of thankless and often horrible task that are required in the middle of a pandemic. But at least what you can do is give them the respect of decent hours, give them the respect of decent training, give them the respect of decent pay, and don't make them sign non-disclosure agreements working for a festival company where they just get some sort of wristband like they're serving beer at field day. It's just, a horrific, I think, way to do crisis management for everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, Children of Men is a dystopian film. Gets a few things wrong, right? One is that the combat troops that are putting down, and people haven't watched it, they should watch it. It's a great film. Alfonso Cuarón directed it, 2006. The army that goes in to destroy a refugee camp towards the end. In reality, and given this, it wasn't meant to be a blueprint. It was meant to be a warning, but our political class seemed to take it as the former, not the latter. Those soldiers probably would have been sponsored by Balfour Beatty, and they would have had O2 and McDonald's sort of sponsorships on them. I mean, it's actually hard to now express the depravity of the British state and its relationship to capital. I mean, it's really, really, really hard. It increasingly feels like something out of a surrealist novel. McKinsey or Deloitte doing tests, and now events management people wheeling around corpses on barely living wage, signing non-disclosure agreements, and it's almost surreal. And this is, people are going to see this more and more, and they're going to say to themselves, well, look, the regimes of places like China are denigrated as kind of backwards. I mean, do you think this is what a modern country does? Do you think that's how a modern country behaves? I don't.
No. I mean, well, it is. I mean, it shouldn't be. Let's say it shouldn't be. And we're going to go on to our final story. We've got 1,400 viewers. We've got 865 likes. Let's at least get that to over 1,000 by the end of the show. It doesn't cost you anything. We're going to talk about a final story, which is a kind of stupid one. It's not particularly consequential, but it has dominated the news, which is that Boris Johnson has had a new baby. His partner, Carrie Symonds, gave birth today to a new baby boy. That meant he missed PMQs. Today it was going to be the first PMQs of him versus Starmer. Dominic Raab stood in, but Boris Johnson has said he will be delaying his paternity leave until later in the crisis. As we say, this isn't the most politically consequential story around, but as you can imagine, some of the country's political editors tried to find political meaning in this event, and definitely the most ridiculous one was Robert Peston's. I want to get this up now. So Robert Peston says, having babies changes us. Near-death experiences change us. Boris Johnson has the full set. So will he become a very different PM from the one the UK voted for in December? Now, I mean, there are so many things that are completely stupid about this tweet. Like, one, it is this kind of reporting of politics like it's a court drama, which just has so little bearing to reality, and anyone who studied politics for a decent period of time would recognize to be facile and ridiculous. But two, this idea that Boris Johnson is going to dramatically change because he's had a child. This is his 6th or 7th child. And I say 6th or 7th because we don't know. It officially was 5 or 6, and now it's officially 6 or 7. So the idea that this person who has been known as, a decent orator, but someone who has only ever really looked out for himself, someone who's never been particularly passionate about helping people or sticking to any one particular ideology, or who doesn't particularly value public service, the fact that he's had his 6th or 7th child is now suddenly, specifically that 6th or 7th child, which is going to bring about this sudden dramatic transformation where he now becomes someone who's committed to the good of the people and becomes incredibly selfless because he's seen the joy and the beauty of new life, and he's understood what it means for someone else to be, to have someone who's dependent on someone. It's nonsense. I mean, he should have been embarrassed for tweeting that. Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, Boris Johnson looks at children like Pokemon. You got to catch them all. He wants one of every different size and color. We say 6th or 7th. It might be many more than that. And what's really strange is that actually Mr. Peston's present girlfriend alleged that Boris Johnson behaved in a rather untoward way to her in the past. And to me, it just shows such a lack of self-respect that you would talk about somebody like that who your partner has made quite serious claims about. I mean, it's just odd. I think, I understand you're a political editor. You have to report on the Prime Minister having a child. I absolutely understand it. The sort of groveling nature of it's kind of, do you not have any sort of respect for yourself or for your partner? I don't quite get it. And clearly there's no truth content to it either. Boris Johnson has had, actually, he's probably had other near-death experiences too. I think he was holed up at some point in the former Yugoslavia as a former Telegraph journalist. Quite a serious political situation. There's been other things like that as well. And like we said, this could be his seventh, his eighth. We have no idea. But I do think what's important is, we're saying, well, it's not an important story. I'm sure some of our viewers are watching this. Come on. Sometimes what matters more than the event is the reception of the event. And history will definitely look on the reception of the event as quite weird. Oh, wow, 45,000 people just died. And these political editors were actually talking about their kids being born. And, when people say, well, in the great coronavirus crisis of 2020, when Britain ended up with the highest death toll in Europe, how on earth did political elites allow that to happen? And they'll go through the primary sources and they'll say, well, look, here's one political editor, and he's talking about the Prime Minister's new baby, giving him a new lease of life, a new vision, a new set of eyes to see the world. Isn't that fucking dumb? Yeah, it's really stupid. How did that happen? Well, we then have to look at the inbred nature of the British political class and the nexus of political and media power. How did that happen? A public school system, insular political culture, the fact that London was the overwhelming sort of cultural compass of the country, etc., etc. So as a historical artifact, that tweet is very, very valuable because it shows the utter depravity and lack of moral scruples and even journalistic integrity of somebody who's a very senior political commentator in Britain. He's an opinion maker. He makes sense of political events. And yet you can see from that tweet, it does anything but make sense.
The ICU thing has been, the fact that him going into ICU has completely changed his approach to the NHS and to coronavirus. I think that is the one that is most widespread and most, I find most disrespectful in a way. I mean, the reason why the government are now more nervous about relaxing the lockdown than they previously were is because they can recognize they're going to have quite likely to have the highest deaths in Europe, and that's going to be electorally toxic for them. The idea that suddenly Boris Johnson has realized that, actually life is valuable, so we are going to put life first over the economy. I mean, you shouldn't even think that as an adult, let alone as a professional political journalist. We're going to finish on to be fair to them, uncharacteristically, Beth Rigby and Laura Kuenssberg had fairly restrained responses to Boris Johnson having a child. Let's get up Laura Kuenssberg's now. And all now becomes clear. Carrie Symonds and Boris Johnson have had a baby boy at a London hospital this morning. The context there was that Boris Johnson previously had pulled out of PMQs. Everyone was wondering why. It became clear and that it was because he was visiting his partner who'd just given birth. Beth Rigby, new Boris Johnson and Carrie Symonds have announced the birth of a healthy baby boy at a London hospital earlier this morning. Mother and baby are doing very well, their spokesman said. As I say, more restrained than usual from those two. But this was shocking. This just simple, objective passing on of the news was completely shocking to the Tories, who have now become so habitually used to bootlicking from these political editors that they get outraged when they are provided with anything less. So I'm going to go to Conservative MP from Lewis and Assistant Government Whip Maria Coalfield. Let's see what she tweeted. So she would have had under that statement both of those tweets, screenshots of them. She says, I think the word Laura and Beth are looking for is congratulations. So not only are we in a situation where we have some political editors who are typing out, the most ridiculous, bootlicking, nonsensical tweets as what Robert Peston managed, but we also, this is so common that when a political editor types something which is just remotely objective, Tory MPs, throw their toys out of the pram. They're like, why are you not treating Boris Johnson like a king like you did yesterday? The whole thing is just, it's mind-boggling.
Well, this is
Aaron, we're going to have to go on.
Yeah, the contempt with which Maria Coalfield is holding senior journalists there reflects the contempt they have for the public. She's saying, how dare you not defer and say how wonderful our Prime Minister is, and how dare you just report something as an objective fact rather than be a cheerleader? Don't you know who you are? You're a journalist. We're the Conservative Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. How dare you? And that is their mindset. And in a healthy democracy, politicians should be scared of journalists. In Britain, politicians intimidate journalists. And the problem is, sadly, that too often the journalists actually are so supplicant and so happy to genuflect and bend the knee They don't have to. But it does display a really unhealthy culture where a politician can lambast a journalist for not congratulating the prime minister. I mean, that doesn't really happen in a country with a healthy democracy and a healthy political culture and a healthy media culture. How has this happened? How have we fallen this far?
Brilliant point to end the show on. We've been going for more than an hour. We'll be back tomorrow night. Thank you for your super chat donations. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thank you, Aaron Bastani. You've been great. See you tomorrow at 8 p.m. We'll be discussing probably Bolsonaro and whatever else is in the news that day.